Hello rowers, this is Travis, back again with another training talk. This one is going to be a fun one because it is very important. I think you guys are going to enjoy it as well, because everybody out there, really wants to know kind of what their training zones are and kind of what speed they should be going. Everyone's always asking, well, how fast should I be going for UT2, UT1, AT? And while I'm not going to be, giving you that kind of answer to figure out exactly what it is, I'm going to be helping you kind of figure out how to understand kind of why those areas are important and how to avoid training at intensities which are going to compromise your development as an athlete. All right, and those intensities are very commonly referred to as gray zones in your training. All right, and so these are going to be the areas between your distinct training categories, and we're going to talk about exactly what those are, kind of maybe a little bit of how to avoid them, but more importantly of why we want to avoid them and what they're doing to kind of harm your training kind of development if you're making the error and spending too much time in those gray zones. And before we do that, before we talk about those gray zones, I want to first kind of talk about this idea of this overall thing of how we are training and why we're training in a certain way to produce speed in racing. All right, and so the best way to kind of break things down is that when you are training or when you're racing, you're drawing speed from two primary categories. You're drawing it from your body's ability to produce energy, and then your muscles' ability to produce to contribute strength or impulse in that contraction. So you have a muscular component and you have an energy component. All right, and this talk is going to be talking exclusively about the energy component. All right, and that energy component, for those familiar with kind of common rowing terms, that's your UT2, your UT1, AT, transport, your lactate, your anaerobic lactate. There are other kind of nomenclatures even within the sport of rowing. You have category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is another way to do it. In running, they'll talk a lot about VO2 max instead of talking about transport. There's just lots of different ways to do it, but even if you kind of follow one way or another, it's not going to matter. Kind of what we're talking about here, the idea is what's going to translate. So even if you're finding this video and you're not a rower, this information is going to be helpful if you don't understand what those gray zones are and why you should be avoiding them. All right, and then kind of before we dive into that again, there's another thing that I want to kind of cover, and that is this idea that when you are in a race situation, regardless of whatever that race distance is, basically there are multiple different components of how you produce that energy that are all kind of being pushed to their max to produce that kind of race speed, that race split, all right, if you're a rower. All right, and so you have your UT2, which is primarily going to be focused on just oxygen utilization, all right, how you're taking in the air that you're breathing and converting it into energy. You have UT1, which is still aerobic, still doing everything of the UT2, but you're also, UT1 is really your body's efficiency with generating carbohydrate and using that carbohydrate as an energy source. And UT2 is, you're always drawing fat as an energy source, and some people may be better at converting that fat to carbohydrate and then using the carbohydrate for energy. Some people are going to consume that carbohydrate, some people are just going to be fat adapted, they're going to create that carbohydrate on demand on their own. But that's your UT1, all right? So that's close to the threshold. And then you have anaerobic threshold, or AT training and rowing. Now AT is a very weird category. AT training it's a very, every sport kind of approach is a little different, and rowing kind of has its own kind of odd approach of dealing with AT training. And the reason for this is that AT training is extremely important for that power component of rowing, because rowing is a power endurance sport and not a muscular endurance sport. And so rowers are going to spend a lot more time at kind of what they call AT, what could probably be better be called maximum lactate steady state if you're using other terms, but basically it's kind of like an inflection point or efficiency point that is beyond your anaerobic threshold. Even though it's called AT or anaerobic threshold, all right, it is well beyond your true threshold between where you're accumulating lactate in the system. But I'm getting off on a tangent there, all right? So AT there's a big muscular component there. It's a big power component with AT. with transport, oxygen transport training, that is the strength of your heart, all right? So your heart's ability to kind of pump a large amount of blood, which is gonna be necessary at maximal effort. And then you have your lactate training, all right? So your body's conditioning to operating in a lactate-rich environment, and you can have lactate tolerance, so its ability to just deal with that lactate, and you have lactate production and removal, so your body's ability to produce and get rid of and filter that lactate. So those are two kind of subcategories of that lactate training. And then you have your anaerobic lactate or your phosphate system, which is just very short burst energy. All right, that's going to be like the first 4 or 5 strokes of your start. That is you're gonna burn through that very quick, and it's going to be kind of less important for endurance sports like rowing, and so we don't need to put as much attention into it because that's going to be mainly a technical focus. All right, but you have all these energy categories that are contributing to that maximal power output at a race effort. All right, and in rowing, we basically break those down, and most coaches are going to break them down to distinct training sessions. All right, so you're going to have a UT2 training session, then you have a UT1 training session, and an AT training session, a transport training session. Some coaches are going to be very skilled about kind of blending and mixing those. All right, so you might be hitting multiple training categories in the same session. Someone like Mike Spracklin is, someone who I think was very talented at doing this and did it often, and for that reason, a lot of his athletes, while they recognize the fact that Spracklin's training was very intensive, it was also very engaging. And I think because Spracklin did a good job of kind of bouncing and kind of touching all these different training zones in his workouts, that it kept his athletes engaged. But that is kind of the summary there, all right? To understand each of these energy zones, and that we're training each of these energy zones so that when we go into that race effort, that it's all kind of coming together. And that's, you can imagine them kind of like all these training zones are members of a team, all right? So they're members of a baseball team, all right? And you have all your different outfielders and your infielders, and they're all training in their unique ways, all right? A catcher is going to train differently than an outfielder. But when it comes to playing the game, all right, when it comes to getting that max effort, they all have to come together in synchrony and work together to produce that performance, all right? So all of these energy components are members of your energy producing team that are going to be trained independently and in different ways and in unique ways. But when it comes to that race, when it comes to that performance, they're all gonna have to kind of come together in harmony to produce that final effort, all right? And so then let's get into those training zones, all right? And how we wanna train them effectively, all right? And I've got my super fancy little dry erase board that I made up here so that you guys can follow along. And basically what I've done here is I've kind of highlighted, so we have our little lactate zone here, we have a little transport zone here, we have our little AT zone, our U1 zone, our UT2 zone, and then I put kind of some lines to kind of mark important speeds. And so 2K speed is going to fall here. It's going to fall between your lactate and your transport. Your 6K is going to fall between your AT and your transport zone. Your aerobic threshold is going to fall just past your UT1, and it's going to be slower than your AT training, all right, for rowing, all right? And so here is our little board, all right? And so the gray zones that we're going to talk about, the gray zones are the areas between each of these training categories, all right? And you'll notice I intentionally used lines for these very distinct points in your energy, but these zones themselves are kind of a broader kind of training zone, all right? And so they're thicker. They're not a distinct point. And so it's not just one split that is your transport, all right? Your transport encompasses a couple splits, whereas your 2K and your 6K max performance is just gonna be one split down to the 10th or 1000th of a second, all right? So with each of these, when you're training in your gray zone, and let's use UT2 as your main one, because we're gonna spend the majority of our time training UT2, training in that aerobic, all right? And this is also where the majority of people have issues training in their gray zone, all right? Because at UT2, it's very easy to get to your gray zone, and sometimes it's more fulfilling because it feels like you're working harder. So let's say, for instance, let's take a round number. Let's say your UT1 is a 2-minute split in rowing, all right? And so let's say that's plus or minus 2, all right? So let's say if you're training anywhere between 158 and a 202, 203, then you're kind of in your sweet spot for your UT2, all right? And your UT1 down here, let's say that UT1 split is a 153, all right? So then with your UT1, and let's say that UT1, it also has its range, but it's gonna be a little narrower range. So let's say your UT1 is a 153, 154, and your actual threshold is probably a 152.5, all right? So just a little bit faster than that UT1 training zone. Well, what you have here is you have between that 158 and that 154 is your gray zone here for your UT training zones, all right? And what happens a lot is that because UT2 is good hard work, but it's nowhere near your max, all right? Remember this, this 2K theoretically is your max, all right, for what you're training if you're training for 2K here. So clearly you can go faster than this, all right? And if you honestly, if you are racing for the duration of a UT2, let's say a UT2 session is 60 minutes, but you were racing 60 minutes, your race speed for 60 minutes is gonna be somewhere around here, all right? It's gonna be somewhere between your threshold and your AT. So you can go faster and still not be at your max, all right? But what's happening is this, all right? So in order to get to a certain training benefit or training zone, you have to push to a certain level of intensity, all right? So if you're rowing a 208, you're not really gonna be training UT2 very effectively. You may be in your UT3, all right? And so you wanna push at least to that 202, 2-minute zone, maybe that 158 zone for your UT2 and to really be training your UT2 effectively. But if you push down to a 156, you are still training UT2, all right? Essentially, if you're going faster than a training zone, you're training that training zone. So if you're doing transport, you're also training AT, you're also training UT1, you're also training UT2 at that time, all right? Not effectively, but you are training it, all right? So you are here, you're sitting at this 156, you're getting that UT2 benefit, all right? But the problem is that you are not going fast enough to get that UT1 benefit, all right? But you are creating more fatigue, clearly, than you would be if you were at the 158 that you want to be for your UT2, all right? So what this gray zone is saying is that you're training to the point, you're training at that 156, you're accumulating more fatigue, all right? Which is going to both decrease the amount of volume that you can spend at that training zone, and volume in each training zone is probably the most important way to train it, all right? Is creating as much volume as it can within, that 158 to 202 is gonna be the best way to train your UT2, all right? So training a 156 for 45 minutes is not going to be a better training stimulus than spending 60 minutes at a 158, all right? You want to accumulate that volume in your zone. But so you're training at that 156, you're probably decreasing the amount of volume you can do, you're going to increase the amount of time it takes you to recover from that session or recover between sessions, and because you're generating additional fatigue, because 156 is harder than a 158. But you haven't increased your speed enough to get the benefit of the next fastest training zone, all right? And so all you're getting is negative training benefits here. All you're doing is creating additional fatigue that is not giving you a return in the next zone of training benefit. And that happens with all of these training zones, all right, here. So if you're training UT1 and you're going faster than UT1, you're actually past that threshold by just a little bit, and you're building up a little bit of lactate, well, that's a huge no-no, because the difference between building up a little bit of lactate and building up no lactate is huge, all right? And so if you're doing that, you're creating this huge amount of additional recovery time and fatigue, but you're still not fast enough to be getting that AT benefit or that anaerobic power benefit that this training zone is going to carry. And then it's also important to note that each of these training zones require a certain amount of volume to train them effectively. So while you are training UT2 zone when you're at UT1, all right, your UT1, you're not going to be able to hold it for as much volume, so you're not going to be able to get the volume that you really want and need to train that UT2 most effectively. That's why we train UT2 separately at its own training zone, all right? And this goes for all of these other training categories, all right? So if you're training transport, and you're doing, a lot of people seem to think that you should be training transport at kind of a race quality effort. And I'm a big opponent of that idea. I do not believe you should train how you race. I think racing is a reserved category of intensity for a reason, all right? You should train hard, all right, but training should never be the same as racing. And that's not to say that you can't go max effort in training, but you're gonna do things for training to kind of cap that performance. Stroke rate in rowing is a key thing. So let's say your 2K, you do a 2K at a 36 at max intensity. Well, your transport, you could maybe say you're doing max effort, but you're doing max effort at a 32 instead of a 36, all right? So while your effort might be the max within the category or within the criteria you give yourself, you're not truly maxed out, because maxed out would mean that your open stroke rate and you can row at that 36. But the principle is the same throughout, all right? So if you're training here, if you do your AT work at your 6K pace, all right, you're going a little bit faster than you need to develop anaerobic power, all right? But you're not going fast enough to create that oxygen transport training benefits, all right? And so again, you're accumulating additional fatigue. It's gonna take you longer to recover between sessions as a result, but you're not getting that additional training benefits, all right? And when this is all said and done, what's happening is that you're just not able to train as much, right? It's gonna take you longer to recover between sessions. You're not going to be able to accumulate as much volume in the gray zone as you would be if you were training in the actual training category. And so because you're not putting as much volume in each of those zones, you're not getting as much of a training adaptation and a training benefits, all right? And that is what you want to avoid. And generally I say, for training adaptations, volume is always gonna be a more effective training stimulus than intensity is going to be, all right? And then beyond that, in certain categories, sometimes repetition, so the number of times you're training something is gonna be more important than volume. And that is true in some cases and not in others. And so I'm a big proponent of, if you're gonna train 2 hours a day of steady state, and your focus is UT2, then you're gonna get a better training benefit by training 90 minutes of UT2 than you are by and then a 30-minute of just easy kind of UT3, UT4 rowing, than you would get a benefit by training 2 60-minute UT2 sessions, all right? And that is gonna be maybe a little bit different than the transport, all right? So the transport, you might benefit more from doing one workout one week and another workout another week, instead of doing one workout every 2 weeks, where let's say if you're doing that one workout every 2 weeks, you did 8 by 3 minutes of oxygen transport, or even let's say 10 by 3 minutes of oxygen transport, and you're doing that once every 2 weeks, you're probably going to train transport more effectively if you did one transport workout each week and you were doing, let's say, 6 by 3 minutes for each of those, all right? And so the individual session might be easier, but the overall volume will be a little bit bigger, all right? So it is a little bit different based on each category, but in general, volume is going to be key. Repetition is also very important, how many times that you're training it, and they're almost always going to be more important than just going faster intensity, all right? Because the intensity really should be targeted, all right, in that zone. And then another thing, before I sign off for this video, I do want to kind of pull back this and say, within these little zones, all right, so I created this kind of little area of lactate, of transport, of AT, UT1, UT2. And so I don't like this idea that UT2 is a split. So I would never say UT2 is 2-minute split. All right, I would say UT2 is around a 2-minute split, but within every workout for UT2, I'm just gonna build in the fact that I'm gonna start around that 202, 203, and I'm gonna finish around that 158. I'm not just gonna sit on and go 2 minutes the whole way through, all right? Same thing for that UT1. I would probably even start a little slower than my UT1. We talked about 153, 154 being your ideal UT1. I'd probably even start that at 155, 56. After 5 or 10 minutes, settle into that 154, and then by the into that UT1. If I'm doing 30 minutes, 40 minutes of UT1, finishing at the 153. All right, AT, whenever I'm doing an AT workout, if I'm doing reps, like 10-minute reps or something, or maybe even within a rep, if I'm doing a 4, 3, 2, 1, 10-minute AT piece where I'm starting, let's say, 4 minutes out of 22, 3 minutes out of 24, 2 minutes out of 26, 1 minute out of 28. Well, you know, that first 4 minutes is kind of going to be very much, you know, on the slow end of that AT, and then I'm going to be finishing at the high end of the AT on that. All right, for transport, if I'm doing 3-minute pieces, and let's say my transport is somewhere between a 142 and a 145, 146, I might even start that first transport piece at that 146, and then I'm going to get maybe a half second or second faster each one, and then finish my last piece at a 142. All right, so I like to kind of negative split and build through the training sessions when I'm training each of these categories. It gives you a little bit of flexibility, you know, to have good days and bad days without it totally messing up your workouts. It's just my preferred way to train, and I think it is the most effective way to train in each of those zones. But that's it. Yeah, hopefully that helped you guys understand a little bit better of kind of how to target your zones. I will say that it will always be better for you to err on the slow side. So if I don't know what my UT2 is, it is a 2-minute. If I'm kind of like this third person omniscient, I know it's 2-minute, but then I go back into my first person and I don't know for sure. It will be way better for me to spend time training at a 203 than it would be to spend time training at a 157, because I don't know what it is. So always err on the conservative side. And you can always, as you're finishing those training sessions, be like, that was a little easier than it needed to be. You can always kind of push a little bit more, all right? Kind of a comment I'd made to one of my athletes this past week. I told him that, you know, if you train at 90% of your ideal training zone, you're still gonna get 98, 99% of the benefit of that, all right? So, but if then you're training slightly beyond it, you can't get more than 100% of the training benefit, but you are gonna develop a percentage of loss, of handicap because of that recovery, all right? So don't be afraid to train a little conservatively, especially early on in either a training session or in a training period, to kind of get a feel for where you should be for training that training zone. And then you can always kind of, you know, ramp it up a little bit and kind of test the waters as you either get deeper into that training session, or if you do multiples of that particular workout within your macro cycle, all right, or even your microcycle. So that's it. That's all I got on that subject. It is very important, especially for kind of, you know, competitive, ambitious athletes that want to go hard all the time. They definitely tend to fall into the pushing into those gray zone training categories, because it's, you know, you're basically just getting closer to race effort. You can hold that higher intensity for the prescribed amount of time, all right? You know, because again, when you're prescribing the time for a training zone, you're never doing the absolute max you could do, all right? You're always training a sub-max volume, all right? So you could always go faster, all right? You're always in a danger of pushing into that gray zone training. So avoid that, be a little bit conservative, kind of experiment with it, and then settle into what that training zone is, but don't let your kind of eagerness push you into those gray zone training categories. All right, that's it. This is Travis. If you got questions, throw them down below. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos like this. If you found it helpful, please share with other people if you think that they could benefit from this information as well. And definitely like this video if you enjoyed the content that you got here today. All right, guys, this is Travis signing off, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.